computer. There we go. So we're going to record, and I just wanted to start the session on Rick Moore. 10 years, it's about 10 years, maybe 11 years now after the Moore decision. And this is that Rick Moore, and he'll explain why he is that Rick Moore in a little bit, but I'm going to give the floor over to you, Rick.
Well, there's nothing special about me, really. I'm just a parent that got really angry about a year into my son's experience at the private school. I realized that there was a method of teaching that works for him. And I got to thinking about how we could barely afford a private school education. A private school education, we would never considered putting our son in a private school. In fact, my mom was a teacher, so I was totally an advocate of public education. But I got to thinking about all the kids that weren't able to go to the private school because their parents couldn't afford it or they hadn't been given the right information. So I started phoning around trying to find somebody that would take up the fight. I didn't necessarily intend to be the person carrying on the fight. So I called the ombudsman and many others, of course, MLA, MP. Anyway, one phone call led to another, which led me to community legal assistance. And it's only because community legal assistance took the case that we were able to fight the 16-year battle that it took to get all the way to the Supreme Court. Of course, in 2012, we won the individual complaints, so we got all the tuition back, and Jeff got some money for the suffering that he experienced, and the Supreme Court said that that other parents could, or other kids could, use that individual precedent to get the services they needed for their disability. However, by throwing that responsibility back onto parents, by not making the Ministry of Education responsible for ensuring that all kids had meaningful access to public education, it means that things are actually worse today than they were back when we started the fight. Hello? Hello? Oops.
You're still here.
Oh, hi.
We're all just taking notes and listening.
Oh, well, the best thing would be for people just to well, I'll say one more thing. There were two paragraphs in particular in the Supreme Court decision, paragraph 63 and paragraph 66, that really continue to frustrate me. So in paragraph 63, the court said, a finding that Jeffrey suffered discrimination and was entitled to a consequential personal remedy has clear, broad remedial repercussions for how other students with severe learning disabilities are educated. And in paragraph 6, the court says, it goes without saying that if the district or districts, if the district is to avoid similar claims such as those Jeffrey brought, it will have to ensure that it provides a range of services for special needs students in accordance with the School Act. So we have the language. We didn't fail entirely. We have the language that clearly states that kids with dyslexia and other special need kids are entitled to access the general education program. They made clear it is the general education program that is the service they're entitled to. So the other thing, of course, that we got out of this decision is that it's not special education that is the service. That special education, as they famously said, is the ramp that provides access to the general education, which all students in BC are entitled to. And of course, they make clear that it's not just any old access, it's meaningful access. So we have the language in that decision. We have a precedent that says one particular kid did not get the meaningful access he was entitled to, and the district had to pay a penalty for that.
Hey,
But
Rick,
then they put, because they did not uphold the entire systemic complaint as expressed in the BC Human Rights Tribunal decision, parents cannot, if they, for instance, if they go to the Human Rights Tribunal, they're forced into mediation. And parents could definitely not do what we did. So that's my introduction.
Rick, one thing I wanted to mention, which I think sometimes is not clear, a lot of people think that it is just about, I think because of the reading wars, you know, the difference between balanced literacy and structured literacy, they think that the case is just about that. But Jeff has such severe dyslexia that he actually should have had access to a remedial center, right? Which isn't just about structured literacy. Remediation is different than actually just getting taught how to read with structured literacy.
Yeah, the way the BC Human Rights Tribunal, the BC Human Rights Tribunal settled on intense remediation. That became and the only service available when Jeff was in the North Vancouver School District was the diagnostic center, which later which was closed, and the ruling was that was the only place where he would have got intensive remediation. To close that without any plan on how to deal with his learning disability was discrimination. To put him, and then they came up with, after the fact of closing it, they said, oh, we would have just, you know, given him more services in the LAC, when the LAC was never intended to be intense remediation. So the school psychologist said, with the closure of the diagnostic center, if there's any way you can put him in this private school, which we'd never heard about, that will be the only place you can go for intense remediation. It's yeah. So we kept coming up against the idea that at the time, you know, there was the part of the reading war was about basically it was a defense of whole language. The idea that any kind of structured or science-based learning was going to turn regular readers off, and that, I think we're still fighting that battle against science-based reading instruction.
It's interesting. I had a meeting today, I mentioned to you earlier, Rick, today with the education minister, Rashna Singh, and Mitzi Dean, who is the head of, or the minister of MCFD. And I brought up the reading wars and mentioned to them that structured literacy was the thing to do. because all the science for the last, 80 years, or everything that's gone into teaching, or the science behind trying to figure out what works for kids and stuff like that is all based in the science of reading. And I said to them, balanced literacy, the whole word literacy comes out of the 60s, and basically I call it the hippie version. They laughed. They're a little bit older than me. And I said, it's a hippie version. I said, basically, it's expose the kids, surround them with a nice room, cuddle them and love them. And of course, they're going to love reading. And I said, from a science background, I call that learning to read by osmosis, which really doesn't work for many.
Yeah, and I remember they were trying to get Jeff to guess.
Yeah.
About things. They just were trying to get him to. They were satisfied in getting him to just write down any gobbledygook on the page. And but the thing is, kids know that it's they're being asked to fake what all the other kids can do, and it's part of what I consider the major problem with the failure of the school system to teach that 25% of the school population how to read. The worst thing is the damage to a kid's self-esteem, because they can see that they're not able to do what their peers can do. So when Jeff went to the private school, the thing that made me most angry about what had happened to him was that when he started school, he had loved to be read to. I mean, I hate the Raise a Reader program. I really do, because it implies that it's because parents don't read to their kids. That's why the kids fail. Well, Jeff was read to. He'd love cuddling up with his mom and listening to her read and look at the pictures. But when he got to school, almost immediately he saw that he was unable to do what all the other kids could do by osmosis almost. And so it didn't matter how often we told him that he was smart, and it wasn't till he went to the private school and he saw that all the other kids in the school were just like him. They were cool, they were fun, and their brains worked the same way. And he started to, and by being given structured reading, a structured reading program, and by going back into a classroom that was in sync with the tutoring. Whereas before, when he went to his outside Orton Gillingham tutor, but then went back into a classroom that was not in sync, where he was still levels behind the other kids. The first thing that I saw at the private school was his self-esteem being rebuilt. So he was in grade 4 when he started the private school. Almost too late, but not quite. So he, as they say, the Matthew effect is that they will never catch up. But his self-esteem was rebuilt within months. And I always tell this story. My mom and dad used to do before and after care, and Jeff was the oldest of 4 cousins that they looked after. Before he went to the private school, whenever there was a disagreement, he would defer to his younger cousins because he didn't think what he had to say had any worth. My parents noticed, and as I said, my mom was a teacher, the first thing they noticed after he started the private school was that stopped happening. He felt smart enough and worthy enough that he started standing up for his own ideas. And that to me, even more than his learning to read, it was the rebuilding of his self-esteem that was the most important thing. And the reason I always tell that story, I always say, so Jeff is our success story. He's the poster boy for all the good things that can happen to a kid who gets remediation in time. But Jeff has an older cousin, 9 years older than him, who we hadn't yet learned to advocate for. And she ends up dropping out in grade 10. Of course, before she drops out, she learns that her self-esteem is destroyed. She never has the building blocks of success that lead to self-esteem. And she starts hanging around with the other kids that are the square pegs in a round hole of the school system. She drops out, and all the bad things happen to her. Drugs, sex trade. The miracle is she's actually still alive because. So I've always been able to try to balance the idea of Jeff and all the others like Becky, the thousands of others that we don't even know about because we don't identify them, because the school system doesn't track them. But we know there's 20 to 25% of kids entering the system that are at risk for reading failure. We know that the dropout rate has remained constant at about 20%. We know that 80% of the prison population is illiterate. And yet the government and the Ministry of Education is not interested. So I know that the Ontario Human Rights Commission report has got its flaws. Number one, that it insinuates that you can cure dyslexia. But the one thing it does do is it recognizes dyslexia. It recognizes, he actually uses the word dyslexia, doesn't run from it. I mean, yeah, it's, whenever I talk, I end up going off on tangents. So jump in anytime to stop me and get me talking about something that that you're interested in.
Rick, we do have a question. I guess Penny Thompson has had her hand up for a while. Do you want to go ahead, Penny? You'll have to probably unmute.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, yes.
Hi, I'm Penny's husband, Jason.
Hi, Jason.
Hi, I'm a lawyer, and I read the Moore decision out of the Supreme Court. And it shocked me because it seems to me that in the school on the ground here in Vancouver, the way that decision's played out is in fact that that decision doesn't even exist.
That's right.
Because we went for our son to get some, we got him diagnosed, and then we went to the school and we asked what they could do for us. And they sort of put together a very useless plan that really didn't help him at all. And without getting into all the details of it, basically there was nothing. They basically said there's nothing that they can do for him. So we've had to move him to the Fraser Academy at $44,000 a year.
Oh, yeah.
Which we, we stretch, like it's a lot of money for us.
So what grade is he in?
He's going into grade 6, so he's a little bit late. But he was in French immersion, and they never had a word. He always got good marks, and he can't read. Really, he really can't read.
Yeah.
But we would have never known this looking at his report cards. And the only reason we had any inkling is because we do read to him every day, and we have him read, and we could see that he couldn't read. And how are you getting these marks? So I guess my question is, like, I read that decision and I thought, well, okay, they have an obligation under Section 15 to give him an equal education, but they're not doing it. They're just like ignoring the decision. So I guess I'm wondering why no one else has waved that decision in front of a judge and said, look, this decision says they have this obligation. They're not meeting it. You know, but it doesn't sound like anybody else has followed up with any other lawsuits since that decision.
So there's a number of things about that, Jason. And number one is you've described my absolute frustration, because when we started the case, it wasn't about Jeff. It was about you. It was about changing the system from the top down.
Right.
And because the Supreme Court said they didn't have to go there, and to this day, when I read the language of the decision, it's like they're almost doing a dance to avoid making a decision against the Ministry of Education. I mean, they quote Mirren and the other famous case about the almost blind person getting the driver's license, and they explain how that could result in systemic change, but they say, well, no, it was just really about Jeff. When the other, I mean, we'd spent 2 years at the tribunal explaining why it was much more than just Jeff.
Right.
They bent over backwards and because they did that, because they let the Ministry of Education off the hook, the ministry feels absolutely immune from any further action on the part of parents. Now, it's conceivable that you could get a class action going, but it's so, I mean, parents are just exhausted just doing what you're doing, advocating for your child, or figuring out a way to put them in a private school or whatever, whatever they're doing. And so that's one thing. So the ministry is totally immune. They already have a system where all the districts, people first have to go through Section 11s to go make an appeal to the districts. We almost had our case tossed out because we didn't do that. We said, what's the point of going and doing an appeal to the district that's already cut the program? But that did delay us getting to the tribunal. And the districts feel immune because tiny percentage of parents are actually going to find a lawyer to bring a complaint. They will say, okay, well, you have to go to the tribunal. You'll get to the tribunal, they'll force you into mediation, and you'll get some little, what happened is you'll go from off the priority list to the top of the priority list to get some little program, which may or may not exist. And even if in your case, Jason, you go back to them and you use our precedent and you say, our situation is exactly the same as Jeff Moore's, I want you to pay my tuition. You may get to court, you may get a decision, and they may pay that tuition. Maybe after you spending, I don't know, a couple of years, because right now I think it takes 2 years, because of COVID, it's taken 2 years just to get a complaint through to the commission. And they pay you back for that tuition. That's chicken feed to them. They pay way more in lawyers' fees every year for all kinds of things. This is, I'm as angry today as I was the day I started making phone calls, which led to the community. Oh, and that's the other thing.
A master's.
They're not going to take a case that is going to take 16 years of their time.
No.
One of the reasons I'm talking to you today is I personally have run out of ideas to drive this forward. The Kathy McMillan is, I've thrown it on her shoulders, but I talked to you today because I hope that somebody will figure out a way to get around this wall that we're banging our heads against.
So Jeff, can I ask a question, as it pertains to the, that you said that the systemic complaint was not held up? Could you explain that a little bit more then? So Jeff got sort of compensated, but can you just sort of explain a little bit more about what that means?
Yeah, so I come back to the thing. It says it goes, paragraph 66 says it goes without saying that if the district is to avoid similar claims, they will have to ensure that it provides a range of services. So what Jason just said is they're not ensuring that.
No.
So they basically are saying that that decision had to be was based on one kid. So I guess we made a mistake that we didn't come there with 1,000 kids, you know, and so but we'd spent 2 years at the tribunal. We were accused of creating a royal commission on education that demonstrated in 100 different ways how there were many, many more kids than Jeff not getting the ramp. And so if here, I don't know if you can see it. This is the BC Human Rights Tribunal decision.
Mm-hmm.
It's 305 pages, and it is basically a royal commission on education. And in this decision, we got everything. The tribunal would have monitored the government to make sure that they were doing what more, that they were auditing programs for success, not just that districts spent the dollars the way they said to spend the dollars, but that the programs were actually effective. And so when I got this decision in 2005 from the BC Human Rights Tribunal, I was on top of the world, because the Heather McNaughton, the chair of she understood it completely. And it would have been a true systemic win that would have forced the government to take the ministry to take responsibility for auditing programs for success, for identifying kids entering. So one of the great things about the Human Rights Ontario Human Rights Tribunal report is they want to screen every kid entering the system. This was proposed by a BC minister several ministers ago, Abbott. And when I heard that they were going to do that, I was, once again, it was one of the moments of, oh, great, wonderful, they're going to do that. Because if they identified every kid entering the system, they'd have an obligation to track them through. And we wouldn't be guessing about, how many of those dropouts in grade 10 are dropping out because they can't read. We would know, because basically academics know, academics in the universities that have been doing the studies on reading, they know. So it's not like the information isn't there, but the Ministry of Education in this province, in my opinion, conspires to keep those numbers invisible, because they know they would have an obligation if the kids were screened entering the system and identified using cheap, inexpensive tools, not psych eds. They would have an obligation to track them. They would have a responsibility for ensuring that the programs were effective. So because the Supreme Court said, no, we don't have to go there against the province, it's just business as usual for them. I can't tell you the number of times I've had personal interviews with ministers of education. I even talked to Christy Clark, before she was premier. They all get it until they're in power, and they don't want to do. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, Penny, but the thing is, the Supreme Court does not want to be seen as activist. They don't want to be seen as interfering with the rights of the legislature to make law. So they will bend over backwards to not be seen as telling them how to make law or how to make educational choices. And it also gets back to the fact that even the Supreme Court, even after reading the entire BC Human Rights Tribunal decision, don't get it. Because if you don't have learning disabilities in your family, if you don't see it in your child and see the devastation that the loss of self-esteem can cause a child, you really don't get it. You know, it's kind of a, oh yeah, but aren't, you know, they'll say, but did you mean phonics? You know, they don't even understand the difference between phonics and phonemic awareness, or you know, because they haven't seen it. You'll have the most success you'll have talking to a politician if it turns out the politician has a dyslexic kid in the family. Then they'll get it, but they're rich. They're most of the people we met at Fraser Academy could have afforded private school education, may have even chosen a private school for their kids. I was a bus driver. I could barely afford it. Michelle was a secretary. But most of the people that we met whose kids went to Fraser Academy, they were lawyers and doctors and you know, business people and so on. So I'm still frustrated, because you think of, you know, we know that dyslexia is hereditary. So you know, maybe the mom and the dad, they also were school dropouts. How are those people going to go and advocate for? They were terrified in their educational experience at school. Maybe they dropped out. They don't have the skills to go and advocate. Maybe they're going to, in danger of becoming the problem parent, you know, of going and throwing F-bombs out of frustration. And then they get banned from the school because it's you can see I'm still incredibly frustrated. So I don't know if I answered your question about the systemic side of the complaint, but because honestly, in their reasoning for throwing out the systemic complaint against the province, I read it. I read it again today. I don't understand their reasoning, actually. I really don't, except that I know why. I actually do know why they didn't want to go there.
So in 2019, Rick, they did an arbitration decision, and I've been hearing this year in particular, I think because 2019 was when COVID started. The 2019 arbitration decision, Lila, you probably know about, or any other teachers in the room. So basically categories Q and category G were looked at in a courtroom. Glenn Hasman was there, as well as who else was there? Oh, I can't remember. Obviously the government. And so they wanted to make decisions on those two designations. And the outcome of it, G wasn't touched, basically. And yep, Lila.
Not really. I mean, so G has changed a little bit. So G is the autism category. And we have to use the old DSM diagnostic criteria for the autism category in order for us to get the sort of additional remedy funding. So there are some changes changes
Some
to
changes.
the G category.
And in the court,
For
they have,
example, Asperger's is no longer part of the new DSM. So anyways, there are some changes to the G category, but it's mostly the Q category that I think we want to focus on here.
right. So, so autism was relatively untouched, but Q came up, and basically the court said, based on, they didn't even have a psychologist. They had a psychologist in for an expert witness for the G category, but they had, I guess, an experienced teacher from a diagnostic center in there, and I don't even know if she was from BC or what, as the witness for I tend to say dyslexia because most of you probably know that dyslexia is 80 to 90% of all learning disabilities. And my kids are both dyslexic, and I am as well. Anyway, so when I say dyslexia, I usually mean all learning disabilities. So the 2019 arbitration said that they would cut the category Q and only have remaining the J categories, what was referred to as the old J category, which Rick might be familiar with. The J category was taken away in 2001. And it came with funding. I want to say maybe $5,000 worth of funding. And that was cut, the funding, and then they expanded the whole category to Q, which included the whole diagnosis of learning disabilities, so all the way.
So, yeah. So J, that was SLD?
Yeah, J was SLD,
Yeah.
and it was severe. So Jeffrey would have qualified for that. And
Yeah,
so
that's right. So I'll just interrupt for 1 second.
Yeah.
So there were two things that happened once we started at the Human Rights Tribunal. Once they realized that it was going to the tribunal, because they tried to first the Human Rights Commission threw it out because we didn't do a Section 11. Then we argued that, and then we had to argue that it was a systemic complaint. And then when they finally realized it was going to the tribunal, there were two things that happened. One, just weeks into presenting the case, they got rid of the Human Rights Commission. So the Human Rights Commission was going to sit beside us, their lawyer would sit beside us and handle the systemic part of the complaint, because that's what the commission had been created to do, identify systemic issues. But the second thing that happened shortly after that was they got rid of SLD. So here's Jeff, first percentile SLD, and their second reaction was just to basically make him invisible once again. Sorry,
that's
I
okay.
didn't want to miss that point.
Yeah, that's okay. So yeah, well, that's what's happened is the arbitration was basically about class composition. And so the government said that, and I will send out the paragraph from the 2019 arbitration to everybody so they can have a look at it. So it said, take away the Q and only have remaining the J, students that would have qualified for J, which is severe learning disabilities. Specific learning disabilities, which means dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and dyspraxia. Or you could have reading disability I'm getting sidetracked here. You all know what I mean. So that happened in 2019. Some districts have interpreted that to mean basically get rid of Q altogether. And I've been hearing from parents that when they get a diagnosis, a private diagnosis, that they go to their district and say, how about an IEP? The district says we are no longer giving IEPs for Q designations because we use universal design for learning. So I've had to go to a few meetings because of that, obviously. In one district in particular, I had 5 parents in the span of 2 months come to me with that. And I got two of them IEPs, but the other 3 I did not. And the poor families, they're like, one family goes to tutoring every single day, and they're worried about there forever, right? And they don't want to send their child to private school. They can't afford it, and nor do they live close to it. It's 2.5 hours away from where they live. So, it's not really an option. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, Rick, what about, this idea that IEPs aren't needed for kids with learning disabilities? And they're bringing that up in Ontario in regards to the right to read. There's groups in Ontario that are saying, now that we've got the right to read, do we need IEPs for students that have reading issues? So what's your opinion on that? I keep saying we need IEPs because that's the parent's document that ties the disability to what the school is going to do. It's their, their reference, their accountability for their remediation or how they're going to deal with the disability, just like the child that has a wheelchair that needs specialized situations because of his wheelchair. What's your opinion if they take away IEPs for Q designation?
Well, the way I look at it is that we know what the basic function of an IEP is, to let parents know what their plan is, to make concrete plans, to put them on paper. To me, that's the function of an IEP that cannot be forgotten, is it's to put on paper the plan. And so my experience of an IEP with Jeff was that they were perfectly happy to create IEPs but as soon as it got to the point where the services were not available, suddenly the language of the IEP would get more and more general. And then when push came to shove, so in the meeting at the heart of our court case, when the psychologist says, we want, he was entitled to go to the diagnostic center. Too bad they've shut it down. Here's what you should do. No notes are taken. And we had to go with our paper trail and put that back together. We had to do freedom of information and all that. So to me, one, there's the function that it's an individual education plan based on the screening, the testing, and eventually a psych ed that needs to be put on paper. And it has to be on paper so you can hold them to account. Mm-hmm. But I've talked to many parents, and when it gets to the point where services are becoming it's apparent the services are not available, the IEPs become more and more meaningless. It's just general language and so on. And it takes a parent to demand certain things. So I've had parents come to me say, my child isn't even on the priority list for a reading program. And I've gone to the meeting, I've slapped down the court case, I've said, this kid is exactly like Jeff, and they go from not even being on the list to being at the top of the priority list to getting into the program. So to me, the IEP is, as you said, a thing to hold them accountable. But unless the parent is skilled enough and educated enough and has learned how to use the case, yeah, and to demand things in writing, specific things in writing, concrete things in writing, the districts will do everything they can to make the problem invisible. Yeah. And that is the problem with our dyslexic kids. So there may be people listening that are in the wider special needs community. And believe me, my heart goes out to the parent of an autistic kid or a parent with fetal alcohol, any number of things. But because this is Dyslexia BC, because Jeff is severely learning disabled, because it's likely I'll have a grandchild that's learning disabled, I'm going to talk about the particular frustration of dyslexia. We know that most kids that need special education have a learning disability, more than all the other disabilities combined. And yet, they are invisible within the system. And the system conspires to make them invisible because they can't figure out how to deal with autism, and they can't figure out how to deal with behavior problems, and they are still don't understand what inclusion means. They don't understand that a continuum of services is in the School Act as part of inclusive education. That a program like a reading program, or even something like Thrive, that's a 3-year program, is contemplated as part of inclusion. I mean, what is French immersion? It's a kind of inclusion. And yet they have their own schools. So how can it be that this large proportion of the school population that we know are there within every single school, every classroom we know has a certain number of kids that are not learning to read? How can year after year these kids be allowed to fall by the wayside? And because one thing dyslexic kids, the number one thing they learn, if they don't get the proper remediation, is how to become invisible. I mean, a tiny percentage of dyslexic kids will act out and become the class clown. Tiny percentage have LD and ADHD, so maybe they become, but the vast majority of dyslexic kids, their great skill is becoming totally invisible. Why? Because they don't want to be exposed. They don't want to be forced to read something in front of the classroom and be exposed as unable to read. They use all kinds of methods to become invisible. And the government, just the Ministry of Education, the districts, just allow that to happen. I mean, you'll get the odd teacher, really gifted teacher, that will say to a parent, I think this kid might be dyslexic, but that's the exception. This is the thing. This is the wall that we just have so much trouble breaking through.
Okay, Rick, it's getting close to 8 o'clock. Mark has had his hand up patiently for a long time. And do you want to ask your question, Mark?
I do, and I'm a patient person, Kathy.
Yeah.
Hey, Rick.
Hi, Mark.
It's a pleasure and an honor to meet you, and this is so cool. I before I ask my question, I just gotta say, like, you get me fired up, and that makes me feel really good. As Kathy knows, my thing is I work with some other amazing women at the ADHD Advocacy Society of BC, but it's a yeah, my son's autistic. We've had to fight for him as well, and that's a whole other story. But I think the question I've got, and I because you were talking about ideas earlier and how you said at the beginning how things are worse now than they were then, and I can see why. I guess my question is this, and how would you bring the other disabilities together and stop kind of that cycle of fund our group? Like, how would you want to bridge those gaps? Because there is a lot of fracture in the groups that I've personally seen. What would you do?
That's a really good question, Mark. And if there is to be a class action that is the only way to do it, is to bring all the groups that of children that need special education together. I mean, there's I always forget their name, but the Special Education Access Group that Tracy Humphreys runs. Gosh, you stumped me, because I mean, I was on the board of the Learning Disabilities Association of Vancouver, and then I became a expert, I suppose, for the BC branch. And I, you know, and it's funny, you mentioned ADHD. So Jeff has a younger cousin, a dyslexia and ADHD, and he was about to get kicked out of school. And one of my first uses of the case was actually to go and slap down the case on his principal and said, look, you've never done anything for this kid, and now you're going to kick him out. But because I had the language, and because I didn't become, start throwing F-bombs or anything, they put him into the apprenticeship program in the school, and that saved him. And he ended up following actually in Jeff's path through plumbing at BCIT. And actually, when Jeff became a fireman, so Jeff has his dream job in life. I mean, I feel like I won the lottery in life. But anyway, Reese followed in Jeff's footsteps. And when Jeff left the plumbing company he worked for, it was Reese that took his place at that company. Because Reese had, with his ADHD and dyslexia, he had not been treated very well at the other companies he'd worked for. Jeff had had the same experience. It took him about 3 or 4 apprenticeships to. So when you get one disability, dyslexia, with another one, ADHD, and then you mix autism and all these things that can combine and just have this, or like we were lucky we just had Jeff, even though in the wider family we had many more LD kids. But you can, have the experience of having 2 or 3 kids, and so we're talking 44,000 for Fraser Academy now. I forget what it was when we went there, but that's many times more than what we paid. And say you have 3 kids, you got to put through. I mean, it's just. But yes, to get back to your point, that's one of the things that I hope the next generation of advocates can figure out. That is what has to be done, Mark. You hit the nail on the head, because unless unless we can get another court case going, as difficult as that is, much more difficult than when we did it, because community legal assistance isn't going to be there for you anymore, I don't think. Really, the only way to do it is to come as a whole special education community. So you're absolutely right. I don't have the answer to that. I wish I did.
That's a good answer, actually.
The funny thing is, I'm not I found I was really bad on the board of directors of LDAV. I'm just the kind of guy that just gets up. I get angry and I get up on my soapbox and shout. And I just got lucky that I got Frances Kelly, our lawyer, who turned out to be the best lawyer, but she's retired now. So we got to get lucky. Yeah, we do have to get lucky. I mean, there has to be a way to make this. I mean, it's there in the language of the decision. It is the right of these kids. There should be a way. But you're right. We need to. It has to be like the civil rights movement in the States. Just people locking arms and marching on. Well, I know Kathy's going to march on the legislature in October. So
yes,
I'll probably be with her.
Yeah,
that's great. That's
great.
good.
So I've actually asked Rick to come and do to speak at that. And I told Mitzi Dean and Rashna Singh today that we were going to be there. I have big plans for October this year, and I've made no bones about telling the government that we're going to start pushing harder. So I would love to have as many people there as possible. So I realize it's a work day, but we do want to be there when the legislation is in. We plan on actually talking between 12:15 and 1 o'clock. That is their lunch break. So please sign up. I've got another Eventbrite scheduled for that, and we'll have a few speakers. If you want to help organize it or help fundraise, we want to try to get we may even get a bus that goes from Tsawwassen down to the legislature for people that want to come over. The rate of concurring conditions between all disabilities is bad. Yeah, that's correct. And autism comes along with dyslexia as well. Yeah, 2 years ago, Mark, you may have been there. I don't remember you being there, but I went with Tracy and Chantal. We did in December. It was really silly of us to do it in December, but we decided to go over, and we had a huge turnout from the politicians. We only had about 10 advocates there, and they listened to us, and we talked to them, and it actually worked for what they were trying to get accomplished. So I think if we turn out in droves, it will be huge for them to see that, because what happens with dyslexia is parents tend to say, oh, it's not that bad. Don't, oh, it'll be better tomorrow. Oh, don't worry. We tend to think, that it's going to get better tomorrow. Whereas with something like autism, you can't ignore it you can't go, oh, it's going to change tomorrow, because it doesn't, unless you do something about it. It's more, Lila, maybe you can help me with this. Like dyslexia is invisible, so we can hide it if we want to. It's kind of like, I hate to say this, being an alcoholic. If you want to hide it, you're going to chew gum, and you're going to hide in the corner and put your head in the sand, right? So
excuse me, I just want to jump in here and just listening to you talk about a protest and going over to the legislature. I just don't think that's going to make much difference. I think the way to approach it and to force the government to make any changes, you have to take them to court, because you cannot get them to agree to spend this kind of money that it would take without a court decision. And we do have a court decision, the Moore decision.
Yeah. And
it's never been brought fully to fruition, because I don't think there's been any other people willing to go that route, because it is so hard to do.
Jason, actually, we've talked to a few lawyers, and even had all kinds of information in their hands, and they've thought about it and turned us down. So if you want to help try to get us a lawyer, we'd be all over it. So
well, I did talk to a class action lawyer named Mogerman, who's one of the top class action lawyers in the province. And his reaction was, well, that sounds like it's not really a class action, it's an individual case. And but he did that quite quickly, and I think it's maybe like he's got enough on his plate. A lot of the lawyers will do that. They'll say, I've got enough on my, and this is a big case, and it's a long road.
Yeah.
And so, you'd need someone who's really committed. And I think that would take, a lot of looking. But
yeah. And you have to get, so on the one hand, the Moore decision was not a complete failure. We did set a precedent. We do have language that shows that they have a right to general education. But on the other hand, the language there is saying that the courts cannot tell the ministry how to the services to provide. And so, sad to say, it is a bit of a stumbling block, this decision, at the same time. And so a lawyer looking at the decision is going to look at the language that they use to deny the systemic complaint against the province, and say, well, I don't know how I get around that. So it's not enough to find a lawyer that is willing to do it. It's coming up with an argument that can, and I think personally that the reason we were able to get what we got out of the system was because we were able to prove that Jeff was harmed. I mean, the reason he got a psych ed in the first place was we were able to go and say, and show them a letter from a neurologist that said his migraines were a result of you not dealing with his learning difficulties. So I think, and I'm not a lawyer, but I think that it requires getting a wide, a lot of kids that have been harmed, where they have letters from doctors that say, here's evidence our child has been harmed, and come at it from that angle. If you get enough, just like if you get enough smokers together that say, I got cancer or asbestos or people, if we could come at it from an angle of harm, that might be the best way to unite everybody. But and come at it not so much from a Moore case thing, but a new angle that's never been tried before. That's just a thought off the top of my head, but that I'm just throwing out there. But I definitely know that when I've succeeded in going to bat for a particular kid in a particular school-based meeting, it's and you can only succeed if the parent has a paper trail that shows the red flags, shows the harm, and that's how, by demonstrating the harm, that's the one thing that puts the fear of God in them. Because now they say, oh, it's not just that we're not providing a particular program, they can actually show we have been harmed.
Yeah, I used to carry a big binder around with me, and I also used to bring the legislation in the other hand. Like I had armfuls of information and I'd put it on the desk beside me.
Yeah.
And I would bring my 2 tutors, and yeah, I don't know, maybe it was overkill, but it worked.
Never overkill. No,
my
that
kids are both on, we're
you can't
both,
have too much paper. Of course, it's not paper anymore, it's emails and stuff. So
yeah.
I'm like out of the dark ages.
So Heather, is that Heather Ma?
Oh, hi, Heather. Hi.
Hi,
ahead.
Rick.
Go ahead, Heather.
So I just wanted to make a quick comment. So when Rick's case was going on, a number of school districts, I guess they panicked and they started training teachers and EAs in Orton Gillingham.
Including North Van School District.
Yep, and so did Coquitlam, and so did Chilliwack. And those are still some of the most skilled teachers that we have. But the point is, while the case was going on, school districts started to jump to action. And so, I mean, from where I sit, and I'm still a school trustee in Chilliwack, things are getting worse. They're not getting better. And everybody's into this push-in now. And push-in is pointless for these kids. So I think if the system itself is scared, if they're concerned there's going to be a lot of pushback from parents, they'll start to react as they did when your case was going on, Rick. But right now, I think, kids in reading, and the whole system's lost the plot as far as I'm concerned.
Here's a funny thing. So I actually, through pickleball,
Yeah.
one of my pickleball partners turned out to be the retired superintendent of the Victoria School District. And since he retired, he became CEO of BCCPAC. And he goes around the province slapping down the court case and getting stuff, whatever little bits available for particular kids, one kid at a time. I probably shouldn't be telling you this because
Yeah, especially
because there are districts that if you're a squeaky enough wheel, will actually under the table slip you the tuition for a private school.
Wow.
Just to shut you up.
I've heard
That-
this. Yeah,
That is a fact. That is a fact.
Yeah.
And this fellow, this friend of mine, who is a total believer in public education, said, you can't do that to somebody in the ministry. And they said, don't sweat it, John. You know, it works. That's how cynical they are.
yeah. And
Please don't get John in trouble, because I've given away.
no, I've heard that. I've heard that from more than one source. And the other thing that I found out at Christmas time, which got me this meeting today with Mitzi Dean and Rashna Singh, was that the private schools like Fraser Academy, Kenneth Gordon, and James Cameron get an extra $2,000 per pupil if they have any kind of designation. So that means even a Q designation, so which the public schools do not get, $2,000 per kid. So I asked them just before Christmas, like I did a Freedom of Information request, and I got the total amount each school gets for the last 5 years. I'll post that, I'll send that to you. That's basically what got me the meeting I had today with Mitzi Dean. And I said to them, why don't public schools get that $2,000 per kid? That would go a long way to actually providing extra psych eds or even screening in kindergarten or a remedial center or whatever. Our meeting got cut short, so I need to follow up with a letter and find out, and I will send you that letter once, and if I do receive it. But I think if we are all there in October, on October the 3rd, and we ask those questions, I'm going to get media attention and all the rest of it on the steps of the legislature with them all there, they're going to be embarrassed. So I think we might have something come out of this if we keep pushing them, because they are reacting to what I've been doing. So
one other thing before, because I'm sure we're coming to the end here, is about psych eds.
Yep.
Psych eds have always been a bee in my bonnet, because they are used as a ticket or a gatekeeper or a whatever, or, you know, and demanded every time, you know, like as you said before, Kathy, you know, how many have you had just to go on to the next year kind of thing. The way I see it, we can do a great job of identifying kids and their needs using the simple screening tests that we have. And a psych ed should be used simply to narrow down the focus of what is the problem. Like any other medical situation. But that's not the way they use psych eds. They use them as a barrier to services. That drives me crazy.
Yes, it drives me crazy as well. And I just wrote in the chat, my daughter's 21 and has had 5 psych eds. The first one she had in grade 1, and it said she is most likely dyslexic, but I don't want to diagnose her because she's so young. And the psychologist gave me a handful of papers and said she is dyslexic, but I can't diagnose her just yet.
Yeah.
So he's telling me one thing but not putting it in writing. When I took that back to the school, they said yep. And literally this principal, for all the good teachers out there and principals and whatever, you know, some of my stories maybe you might not think are real, but this was real. She held the psych ed above the garbage can and said, if I had $1 for every time I had a PhD psychologist tell me a kid needed an IEP, I'd be rich. And
well, the other thing about psych eds too, is there's always this misunderstanding that they're going to be cured.
Yes,
you know, exactly. They're using the psych ed, you know, 4 years later. CRA is a classic example.
Yeah.
Say, oh, you must be cured by now, so you got to go it just to prove something that's scientifically impossible. You and I have both had experiences with CRA. Luckily, when I went there, I could throw down the case once again in tax court and say, here's a psych ed that's been vouched for by the Supreme Court of Canada. Quibble with that, CRA. But But yeah, it's this idea that they can be cured.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what they're interested in. They're not interested in using the psych ed to hone in on the particular difficulty of that kid. They're using it as a gatekeeper.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, and it continues, like if you want to do post-secondary or try to claim the disability tax credit or whatever, it's like, okay, well, you haven't had a psych ed for 5 years. I mean, ADHD, Mark, maybe you can correct me. You get diagnosed once and they know that you have ADHD for life. But for some reason with a learning disability, every 5 years or so, Lila, go ahead.
Because with a learning disability, now we know that there's two different types of learning disabilities. In essence, there's like the organic, stuff like my learning disability definitely was sort of natural, classic learning disability, but there's also the environmental or that it's a lack of opportunity to learn.
Right.
So they are trying to make sure that those kids that have had a lack of opportunity to learn have had the chance to have supposedly intervention, targeted evidence-based intervention, and then hopefully for those kids, they're remediated. So because of the changing and developing nature of children and brain plasticity, a school psychologist will look at a psych ed and say it's probably valid for about 5 years. Executive functions come online. Maybe it was working memory when they were in grade 3, but now it's more processing speed. So we want to look at that, how it's changing as the brain grows and develops. But having said that, one of the things we were just talking in the chat about having private psychologists do psych eds, maybe that'll help with the backlog in terms of the diagnoses. But for us school psychologists out there in the field who are drowning, knowing that the folks that have retired are not getting replaced. And so we're feeling like, okay, yes, that's great. I've got this psych ed that's come in from, UVic or whatever. I still have to read it, interpret it, and determine whether it's a Q or a J, right?
Right.
So a specific learning disability based on the DSM might not meet Ministry of Education criteria. So I still have work to do. And then the teams out there in the field, those school-based teams, they don't know what to do with it. So Lilo, can you come in and interpret this psych ed? So I'm doing all of the back work anyway. So it's not necessarily alleviating it, because then I have to make sure, do I really know this kid? I can't just go in and look at a psych ed from an outside agency and say, I know the kid just based on the paperwork.
Right.
I have to know what the kid is doing. I maybe need to do a level B achievement test to find out what exactly it is. Do some sort of, is it the R controlled vowel that they're having problems with? Like all of those things. So in essence, if you're going to lobby for more assessments, I love the idea of doing early screening. Kindergarten screening is not a bad idea because you can do early intervention with early screening, provided we can get that screening into schools and into the hands of educators and educators who understand how to do like phonemic awareness. What's the difference between phonemic awareness and phonological processing? They don't know. So early screening is good. But if you're going to advocate for full on psych eds, I really would really start to lobby for more school psychologists who are actually trained in this. Like, you don't want a clinical psychologist who, I mean, not to diss my clinical psychology friends out there, but that's not their area of expertise, right? Maybe their area of expertise is dealing with schizophrenia.
Yeah.
They can still give you a psych ed or give your child a psych ed, but it's not their area of expertise.
Mm.
So it still falls on our lap anyway.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And actually, one of the heroes in our story is the school psychologist that had the guts to say, with the closure of the diagnostic center, you should send them to the private school. However, when it came to the court case, she actually signed an affidavit, or was forced to sign an affidavit saying, oh, it was only one of many things. But I was able to go to CRA because I talked her into talking to the CRA appeals officer and explained to that appeals officer that the school was the only option for Jeff, because of course it wasn't in writing at that last IEP meeting. And then when she signed the affidavit, I was able to get that transcript of that phone conversation, and that became actually a key piece of evidence in why we won. Because when she was presented with the transcript, she said, "Oh, yeah, well, that's true." But why did she sign that affidavit? She was caught between a rock and a hard place. Oh, I'm doing good work within the school system. Oh, I guess I'll, sign this thing, knowing it wasn't true, technically. So it's only because, a bad thing, being audited by CRA for his tuition as a medical expense, which was horrible, turned into a good thing because I was able to get the transcript, only because she didn't have to agree to talk to the CRA agent. So many things happen, many kind of lucky things happen to even get through to the Supreme Court. It's it almost kind of the odds of us getting through for that decision, for whatever we make of it, we beat the odds to do that. So I am proud of that, but it took a lot of luck as well. I mean, just getting Francis Kelly, our lawyer, was a lucky break.
Yeah, I agree.
And that's what it's going to take. We need some luck. It's time for these kids to have some luck as a group.
Heather brought up a really good point, and I was going to talk about this. Rick, I mentioned it earlier, and I'm going to share my screen for a minute here because this is something to be really excited about. Share. First, when I share my screen, I get. There we go. I want to make this, should have opened it before we got here. I'm so sorry. There we go. So Heather brought up the fact that the BCSTA passed, so this is my presentation from today with the Minister of Education. I'm super sorry about this. Oh, come on. Okay, so in the BCSTA and BCCPAC, which your DPAC is part of, somebody was asking about going to the DPAC. So this spring at the AGMs of the BCSTA and the BCCPAC, they both passed resolutions. Resolutions were for the BCCPAC and motions were for the BCSTA. So the BCSTA made a motion, and this is a motion: learning disability, dyslexia, and policy guidelines for screening in kindergarten was passed unanimously, which means that the BCSTA will advocate to the Ministry of Education for everything it says there. And I know that Cindy Gerlach, she was on the call here. She was the trust. We have a few trustees on the call here. And Cindy was the trustee from North Vancouver that brought it forward to the floor. And thanks so much, Cindy. It's so awesome that this happened.
I was so happy to hear about this. Thanks, Cindy.
Yeah, so I told the minister today that we were Dyslexia BC was going to align their advocacy efforts in line with these, which I mean we were already in line with anyway. So that's what BCST put forward, and then a DPAC out of Kootenay Lake, which is SD8, they came up with these two resolutions, replacing all reading programs to align with the science of reading. And the second one was literacy centers fund. This was my spelling mistake, funding and policy. Basically, they have agreed to advocate to the ministry for these two things. So altogether, like that's almost everything we could want, right? So I'm going to make a big deal in October about this, and hopefully the BCSTA will be right behind me, and same with the BCCPAC. So you can go to your DPACs with these or even your trustees and say, okay, when is this happening? Can you keep me informed? I want to know. So as simple as that, like put it in writing, go to your DPAC and make sure it's on the meeting minutes of your DPAC or your, and just keep at them. From what I understand, and I need to follow up with the BCSTA, nothing that has ever passed with the BCC PAC has ever happened. So basically the motions get tabled and they're out there and they probably do get brought up with the ministry, but they are not followed through. So part of my advocacy is going to be, well, how come this is with the BCC PAC? Because there were other actual motions passed in the past that had to do with literacy centers. So I got these ideas. Well, I have just been found out. I actually helped SD8 based on what they asked to find what they want, to find resolutions to bring forward. And we looked through all the resolutions. So these were based on things that we already found that were standing still and weren't acted on by the ministry. So that's going to be the next advocacy goal, is making sure that whatever BCC PAC brings up is actually followed through. And I'm going to need their help to do that, obviously. So any of you that are on DPACs, go to your DPAC and say, what can I do to make sure that the ministry actually looks at these? And same with trustees that are on here. If you could go to the BCSTA and say, what do we need to do to bring this forward? And what do we need to tell people? So anyways, anybody have any questions for these? I'm going to stop sharing, hopefully. There's certain things with Zoom I'm not that great at yet. There we go. Okay.
Yeah, I was there at the BCC PAC, actually giving a talk with John, my friend John, and that was that was exactly what I was wondering about, Kathy. I mean, what were the odds of the ministry paying any attention, you know, even with, because they feel immune. They don't feel they have to respond to anybody if they don't feel like it.
Yeah, exactly. They do. And that needs to stop, because, you know, we are voters, we vote in the politicians, and they're supposed to be directing the ministry, not the other way around, right? So
I use the example of Abbott when he was minister, and he made the proposal to do early screening, and he was on the radio making the proposal, and then like a week later, he wasn't talking about it. So I had the feeling somebody tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Oh, no, you don't want to say that, John, because you'll have to do all these other things." And so who's really running the show? It's those mandarins that, you know, you can occasionally get an interview with, but they're the ones that have the power to well, they control the politicians, really, because the politicians, they're only really concerned about the next budget or the next election. And I have talked to politicians of all stripes. When we started our case, it was Socreds. When they shut down the diagnostic center, it was NDP. Then it was the Liberals. It doesn't matter what political stripe. This is changing the education system. It overwhelms them, the politicians.
right. So Rick, on that note, that's kind of a sad
On
note.
that depressing note.
8:30. I am going to send out an email, because the reason I like to use Eventbrite, it makes a nice email list for me. I'll send out an email probably in a couple days, and sort of condense what we've gone over. In the meantime, I will send an email immediately so that you have my email. And Rick, is it okay if I give out your email?
Sure.
Okay. Well, I shouldn't have asked you on screen, I guess. Sorry. So if you have specific questions for Rick, you can ask him. But if you want to email any more general questions to me, I can put the answers out in a follow-up, probably, what is today, Wednesday? Maybe on Monday. And I will also put the recording of this out on Monday. And thanks everybody for being so interactive. I'm really sorry about the hacked little bits at the beginning. I'm not sure why we were hacked, but anyways, thank you, Rick, for ignoring it. Thanks again for all your advocacy, Rick. I know you feel a little bit sometimes that it failed, but there's so many positive things that have come out of it in terms of advocacy, and even having a group like this together is all because of you and the work that you did and worked so hard at. So thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kathy, and thanks for all the work you do. For keeping fighting the good fight. Thank you. And to all of you for fighting the good fight. I really appreciate it.
Okay, well, thanks. And I'll send you a few emails in the next couple of days, everyone, and please forward any more questions. That would be great. Thanks again. See you soon.
Bye.
Okay, bye.